Welcome back to the King Films college football playoff predictions. And going into week 8, we had a crazy last week, and we'll see that with the top of the rankings. But let's start out with number 25, South Alabama. This team's very solid, only one loss on the season out of the Sun Belt, and it was to UCLA. Obviously, everyone points to the botched fake field goal attempt as the reason they lost, but wow, this season could be a whole lot different for South Alabama as they controlled that game if they did win it. Number 24, we've got Mississippi State. Came off a terrible showing at Kentucky. They've struggled on the road this year. That's their second loss on the road, the first being to LSU. They move on to play Alabama in yet another tough road game for this Mississippi State team. They go into that as 23-point dogs. 23, we've got a new team in the ranking for me. It is North Carolina. 6-1, their only loss was pretty decisive to Notre Dame. That's why I've been hesitant to rank this team. Also, when they went to App State, they almost lost that game a variety of times. They did control it for the most of the game, but that was always a warning light for me. Number 22, we've got Purdue. They stay upright. We've got a tough game this week against Wisconsin. Number 21, we've got Kentucky. After their win over Mississippi State, they moved back into my rankings. The AP poll had them in the whole time. I did not, but they took care of business there, so they rejoined the rankings. Number 20, Tulane continues taking care of business in the American. Of course, I have them up here a little higher. We've had them for 3 weeks in here, and they continue taking care of business. Obviously, they have that marquee win over Kansas State. Number 19, we've got Illinois, who continues taking care of business in the Big Ten. Then Utah moves up from number 24, 6 spots after barely edging out USC in a crazy game at Rice-Eccles Stadium. They bounce back from that loss against UCLA to number 18th. They are in a good position to make the Pac-12 championship if they can win out. Number 17, we've got Wake Forest there. Moving into the middle 8 teams, we've got Texas, who is coming off a win of their own. They will play at Oklahoma State next week in a tough game there. Then Kansas State also continues taking care of business in a rugged Big 12. It looks like at this point they have a tough road game at TCU, who beat Oklahoma State this week. We'll get to them later. Number 14, Penn State dropped down a couple spots after that pretty decisive loss to Michigan. Penn State never really had a chance, but we won't really know how they are until they continue to face some of this Big Ten competition. Number 13, we've got Syracuse. They beat a banged-up NC State team. Of course, Leary out for the season. That is why you don't see NC State on here. I just don't think this is that good of a team. Leary obviously had the pectoral injury, but Syracuse stays undefeated, and they go into a showdown of their own with Clemson. Of course, it is on the road, so Clemson is heavily favored in that one. USC obviously lost to Utah in crazy fashion. Probably the only way they could have lost was that 2-point conversion. It goes down. Unfortunately for them, they stay pretty high on the rankings because, like the team in front of them, they controlled the game for the vast majority and only choked at the end. Number 11, Oklahoma State did the same thing to TCU, but TCU came roaring back, won in double overtime as Oklahoma State had to settle for a field goal, which was heroic just to go in from 50 yards out. They move on to face Texas at home. Of course, they can bounce back right away, and I think they will. Check out the locks for our pick on that game. And number 10 and number 9, Oregon and UCLA both had byes. This is going to be game day. This is a great game for the Pac-12. Don't have USC undefeated anymore, but the winner of this is in serious college football playoff contention. Obviously, Oregon does have the blemish from that Georgia game, so it would be better for the conference if UCLA won. Moving into the top 8, we've got TCU. As aforementioned, they squeaked out the win over Oklahoma State last week. They move on to play Kansas State at home. This schedule is breaking pretty good for TCU right now. Number 7, we've got Ole Miss. Moves up a couple spots after their performance on Saturday. Number 6, we've got Clemson, who will move on and play Syracuse. Sorry about the typo there with the Penn State logo, but they will play Syracuse at home. That should be a decent game. Clemson's favored pretty heavily, but we'll see what happens there. Number 5, Alabama gets a chance to bounce back after that crazy Game of the Year candidate against Mississippi State, a ranked Mississippi State team at home in Bryant-Denny. So I think Saban will have his guys ready for that. And I'll just address it here. The reason I have Alabama over Clemson, although it probably won't stand after this weekend, we'll see what happens. I think Syracuse is a better win, obviously, than Mississippi State. But the reason Alabama controlled that Tennessee game, and while they were down for the majority, they had a chance to win if they kicked that field goal. Clemson also got lucky in a game, if you remember, against Wake Forest. Of course, both of those were on the road. And Tennessee, obviously, as you see, is my number 1 team. So I can't really punish Alabama that much for that game. I can see how a lot of you might think that Clemson and Alabama should be swapped here. I think it is a slim margin, but I'm going to have Alabama over Clemson for now here. Then number 4, we've got Georgia. Number 3, Michigan, coming off that massive win over Penn State. They move up a handful of spots here, but they don't overtake an Ohio State team that continues to roll in Big Ten play. It will be interesting when they have to go to Penn State. We'll see how that game goes. And then number 1, Tennessee. You can't argue with Tennessee being number 1. They beat number 1, for me at least, last week in Alabama. They're undefeated. They just crushed LSU on the road the week before, so you can't really argue with Tennessee here. Of course, that game at Pitt was the sticky one for them, and that is an interesting game to think about how if it had gone the other way, but it didn't. So Tennessee is the number 1 right now. Of course, everything will change here, and we will get those college football playoff rankings in a couple weeks, so we'll see what happens with those. Let's move into the bowl predictions. We've got number 1 seed Tennessee, the Peach Bowl against Clemson. The reason I don't have Alabama in the playoff, obviously, is these SEC teams, they can't all be in the playoff. I think if Tennessee loses to Georgia down the stretch, doesn't make the SEC championship, I think that both those teams still get in. I think that the winner of the SEC East at the moment will take out the winner of the SEC West, but, you'll have to see. There was a couple scenarios I was looking at where, it could be 4 teams if Ole Miss, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee win out, except for the games where they're playing each other, which is a crazy scenario, but it was worth a thought or two. Ohio State playing Georgia in the Fiesta Bowl, and then Tennessee playing Clemson, as I mentioned. UCLA against Michigan in the Rose Bowl, but obviously I'm going to change that depending on the result this weekend. In the Cotton Bowl, Oregon plays Tulane, replaces USC in that game. And in the Sugar Bowl, TCU replaces Oklahoma State. Alabama, of course, swapped with Tennessee for that one. And then Orange Bowl stays the same as last week. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe as we are on the road to 2K, and drop your comments and thoughts on the predictions below.